Hey everybody, it's Ruby here today, and I thought I would do the reading in school tag. I came across this tag on Ariel's channel where she had created it, so I will link her video as well as the questions down below. The reason I wanted to do this tag was because once I started to hear the questions and started to read about it, I realized that it had a lot to do with literacy in school, and it isn't something I generally think about when I think about my past years. I sort of taught myself how to read in a way, and as a result, I haven't really thought about how you're taught to read. But I've had a lot of great teachers. I have a lot of family members that are teachers, so I thought it would be quite fun to try and answer these questions. So the first section is elementary, and the first question is, what techniques do you think that teachers should use to engage young readers? I think that the main thing teachers should do is to try and pick a lot of variety and a lot of very interesting books or sort of topics to read about. I noticed that when I started to not get very interested in reading, or when I found it extremely tough, was when I found the subject matter to be extremely dry. And I think that if you teach students that all material is dry and textbook-like and, reading and comprehension booklets, then that might not always be a good idea. So in grade 2 and in grade 1, I was actually read to in school, and I was actually read Harry Potter, among other things, and I was able to discover novels, and I was able to discover reading without having to stumble through it. I think this is also a good thing for people who might be less able to read or find it a little bit harder, is that they're able to find engaging books of their own and perhaps push their way sort of to the next level of reading. I think that it's the school's job to instill a love of reading in students, or in children, I guess. I think that's kind of related to the first question. I mean, it is in the same sort of grouped categories, but I do think that if you're able to engage a reader already, if you're able to teach reading and show that it's fun, then you're able to also engage them, and you're also able to show, a love for books. I do think that some of it is parents' responsibility. A lot of my love for books was having memories of this library we had in one of our bedrooms, and just having cozy places to read and being read to. And I think that that generally helps as well, because if you have a school where they show you that there's a love for reading, but at home, people are just watching TV and watching movies, then there might be a disconnect where maybe they find it fun at school, but they might not be able to bring it home or, have a safe place to read. So I think it is a school's responsibility, but I also think that they can only go so far. And the final question is, what was your favorite elementary read? This is also a kind of hard question, because I went from just being able to read those little readers in grade 2 and 3 to being able to read full novels by the time I was in grade 4, or during the age of 9. So I would have to say that there's a large variety. I did a childhood book tag as well, which I'll link down below, and that has a more description as to what kind of books I liked. But in general, Harry Potter, Tamora Pierce, the series of Unfortunate Events, and a lot of fantasy books. I loved Terry Brooks, and I think I read The Hobbit and the first Lord of the Rings. The next section is high school, and the first question is, do you think that an incorporation of young adult books should be made? If so, which young adult book would you add? So this was actually a question that made me realize that I think my education in junior high and high school was actually pretty good when it came to English literature, because although we had to read the standard Shakespeare and that sort of thing, a lot of what we read was young adult, or we were at least given the freedom to read a young adult book. So there was The Bell Jar and Life of Pi and those sorts of things that I think, although they are more of classical literature, or are soon to be classical literature, I think that they are books that I tend to gravitate towards, and so I never had a problem being engaged by high school books. So there's no really books that I would add, because I feel like in high school you are meant to analyze books, and you are supposed to analyze motifs and things, and I think that some young adult books don't have that. Not all, just saying, but I think that the ones that I'm familiar with I wouldn't necessarily add, because I don't think that they would have that level of complexity that would be necessary for a high school class. And any of the other books that I would consider to be very complex would probably already have been added, if that makes sense. I would definitely add John Green or something, but I already know that at least in America he's been added in a couple of different schools. Second question, do you think that it is important to read books from a wide variety of nationalities? Now this, I think, was probably the pinnacle question, because at first I'm like, yeah, we have. And then I realized that most of the books that I had read and that had been important in my English classes were actually Canadian. And a lot of the curriculums that I'm familiar with are very Canadian because they just gravitated towards that. They wanted to make sure that we knew our own politics and our own history before we learned about other countries. And I do think that that is very important, but I think that that made it incredibly lacking in other countries and other ethnicities and other sorts of points of view. So I would have rather not have read all of the very dry Canadian literature that I had to read. I know not all of it is, but the ones that I read definitely were. And I would add a lot of different countries into that, because I'm slowly being introduced to other countries' literature and other countries' storytelling, and I'm really regretting not having learned that. So I definitely think so. And I really think that fiction is a great way of showing another person's perspective. What was your least favorite book in high school? Adding to that dry Canadian fiction, the book that I disliked the most was a book I think I had to read in grade 10, and I was known by this English teacher as disliking it quite a bit, and that was Who's Seen the Wind by W.O. Mitchell. This is a book about a 10-year-old or younger child who sort of reflects on his life and reflects on life in the prairies, and it has a lot of Canadian nature descriptions and that sort of thing. I didn't particularly like it because I lived in the prairies. I lived like on a farming community, so I already felt like I had understood a lot of what he was saying. And second of all, when asking my grandfather and my father about this book, they both agreed that it's more of an adult book, that it's a book that makes you kind of reflect back in history. And I wasn't really old enough to be able to do that. I was 15. I only had 15 years, and you know, I've only really been conscious for about 10. And then there's one last section beyond, and there is, do you think that there should be an emphasis on creative writing? My school had a creative writing class, and I found that anybody who's in the creative writing class was already people who liked English. So I think that there's definitely a tie between like an English or language arts class and liking creative writing. I did have a lot of emphasis in elementary and high school for creative writing because it's sort of connected, and I definitely think that it should be incorporated, because I think that you're better able to interpret books if you kind of know the writing process and if you sort of know how it comes about. Do you feel that the reading you did in school has affected the reading you do now? Yes. In elementary school, I read a lot of fantasy. In junior high, I read a lot of fantasy. Once I got to high school, I was introduced to a lot of classics. I was introduced to a lot of different kind of reading, of motif reading, of symbolism, things that I was already reading into the books, but now sort of had a vocabulary for understanding. And so I've started to lean towards books like that, because that gives, to me, that's really fun to sort of analyze a book and to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of what the author is saying. Sorry about that, my battery just ran out, so hopefully it doesn't look too different behind me here. So the last question is, if you had to choose one book that you've read in the past year outside of school that had to be taught in high schools, what would you choose? Now, most of the books that I've read so far, because I'm fairly new to BookTube and most of the books I've read have been university books, I'm actually going to choose a book that I haven't read yet, but I think is a very good concept for high school. And that's S, the book by J.J. Abrams, which I did an unboxing for, which I'll also link down below. I really think that this would be an interesting book because it is a book about books, and it is incredibly, it's supposed to be sort of the love about books and sort of an analysis of graduate students. So I think it would definitely appeal to the literary crowd, and it would also probably get a couple of other people going that maybe don't necessarily like English as much. Maybe I'll change my tune once I actually read it, but so far that's the impression that I've had from this book. So that is everything. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this tag, and of course, as always, I'll have all the links down below. If you want, you can do a video response down below, or of course you can just comment telling me about your experiences in school. Like it, thumbs it up, subscribe, do your thing, and I will talk to you guys later.